Heavy, gray clouds hung low over the town, as if warning of impending trouble. A gusty wind howled through the narrow streets, and sparse raindrops fell like scouts on the cracked roads, kicking up dust and the smell of earth. The inhabitants did not yet know that this was only a prelude to the catastrophe that would turn their lives upside down. The rain came suddenly. It was thick and heavy at first, and then it turned into a torrent of water that never seemed to end. The downpour drowned out the sounds of the city, and only the occasional shouts of people broke through the noise of the falling drops. The rivers that usually calmly wound around the outskirts swelled beyond recognition. The water rushed down from the mountains in a furious torrent, tearing down trees and engulfing everything in its vortex. The old bridges began to crack, as if complaining of an impossible load. One of them collapsed into the roaring abyss, taking with it guardrails and cars whose headlights were still flashing one last time before disappearing into the abyss. On Center Street, water burst sewer manholes and rushed into the basements of homes, taking sleeping families by surprise. People scrambled to save at least their most precious possessions, but there was no time left. Houses made of wood and brick began to collapse like houses of cards. Dense waves knocked people to the ground and swept them into the torrent. Panic gripped the city. Cries of "save" and "help" merged with the deafening noise of the whirlpools and the crackling of collapsing structures. The air smelled of dampness, dirt, and despair. On the outskirts of the town stood an old house with a drooping porch. The windows had long since darkened and the paint on the walls was peeling. Mrs. Hudson lived there, an old woman known for her kindness and patience. She had hardly left the house since the loss of her husband, and now, sitting on the second floor, she watched as the water flooded the first floor. Her hands shook, but she continued to clutch the picture of her family, unable to leave it, even as the water level rose higher and higher. Every new sound outside the window sent her into a state of fear. The creaking of branches, the slamming of water against the walls, the cracking of metal, all seemed to her to be harbingers of doom. The street was no better. People tried to reach tall buildings, grabbing onto surviving supports, but their efforts often ended tragically. A family with 2 small children, frightened teenagers, a lonely old man with a dog in his arms. They were all in the same desperate position, fighting for every breath. But the worst part was that help was in no hurry. Telephones did not work, and the city was cut off from the outside world. The rescuers could not get through the storm, and the residents were left alone with the merciless elements. It was at this time, amidst the chaos and despair, that he appeared, a boy of about 14, barefoot in soaked clothes. No one knew his name yet, but his look of determination already stood out among the frightened faces. Clutching the thick rope he had found in the ruined barn, he stared at the churning water as if defying nature itself. He didn't know then that he had a feat ahead of him that would change everything. His name was Michael. To the people of the town, he was a barely noticeable boy, always running barefoot through the dusty streets. No one really knew where he lived or who his parents were, but everyone was used to his quiet presence. Sometimes he worked part-time in Old Man Jenkins' shop. Sometimes he helped the market vendors carry crates. Michael was the kind of kid who grew up early, learning to depend on himself. He lived in a dilapidated hut on the outskirts of town, near the forest. There, under a leaky roof, he cooked for himself, washed his clothes, and slept on an old mattress covered with coarse cloth. He did not care about pity, for he had learned to find joy even in small things. For example, on hot days he liked to run to the river, build rafts of twigs, or watch the sunlight play on the water. The river seemed to be his friend, but that day their friendship was jeopardized. Michael had noticed that the water in the river had begun to rise rapidly the day before. He tried to warn passers-by, but no one listened to him. Children always think of something, adults thought. At dawn, when the rain turned into a deluge, Michael realized that trouble was inevitable. He ran out of the hut and toward town, despite the downpour. In the streets, he saw things he still couldn't forget: flooded houses, people screaming for help, children's toys and belongings floating in the muddy water. Panic was overwhelming the town, and with it a sense of responsibility overwhelmed him. He couldn't just stand by. His humble life taught him to appreciate every little thing and to help those in need of support. His mother, who died when Michael was 8, always said, "If you can make the world just a little bit better, do it, Michael, even if it's scary." Those words sunk deep into his soul and became the guideline by which he lived his life. The boy walked over to the old workshop warehouse where Jenkins kept ropes and tools. Michael knew that what he needed now was something strong enough to withstand water and the weight of a man. Grabbing a long rope, he ran on, wading through the raging stream. His bare feet slipped on the wet ground, but he did not give up. He saw a woman standing on the roof of a ruined house, a little girl screaming from a window, and a man clinging with all his might to a floating log. His heart clenched with horror, but he kept moving forward until he was in front of Mrs. Hudson's house. Her face he recognized at once. She often gave him apples from her garden as he ran past. Her kind eyes had always looked at him with warmth, as if she saw him as a relative. Now her gaze was full of despair. The water had almost reached the second floor, where she stood shivering with cold. "Mrs. Hudson," Michael shouted, wrapping the rope around his arm. "Hold on, I'll be right up." "Michael," she gasped with fear, barely audible. "No, don't risk it. You could drown." But the boy was no longer listening. He threw one end of the rope to the nearest pole and tightened the knot. Then, slowly and carefully, he waded through the flooding water, holding on to the taut line. The icy water slammed into his face, cutting off his breath, but he persevered. When he reached Mrs. Hudson, his hands were shaking with exertion, but his gaze was steady. He tied a rope around the woman, making sure the knot held, and began to slowly pull her back, helping her across the stream. It took long, exhausting minutes, but they reached safety. "You saved me," the woman whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. Michael only nodded, watching the other residents look at him with wonder and hope. He knew that this was only the beginning. He had much more to do to help those who remained trapped in the elements. The water kept coming. It seemed as if the river, angry at the people, had decided to swallow the city. The raging torrent was so powerful that it flooded the streets up to the level of the roofs of the first floors. Swirls of mud, twigs, and debris swirled in the watery chaos. A heavy odor of dampness and destruction filled the air. Michael had already led Mrs. Hudson out of her flooded house, but he had one of the most difficult tasks ahead of him: to guide her through the raging torrent to higher ground. The water was growing faster every moment, and its coldness was penetrating to the bone. The old woman, holding on to the boy's arm, was too weak to move on her own. She could barely move her legs, shivering with cold and fear. Michael knew that one mistake could cost them both their lives. "Mrs. Hudson, hold on to me tightly," he said, turning to the woman. His voice sounded firm, though he felt a muffled fear inside. "I won't let you go, I promise." He wrapped the rope around his belt and secured it a second time around the woman's body. The water pounded against their legs with such force that Michael could barely stay in place. Every step was difficult. They walked along the road, which was now a river. To the left and right, they saw pieces of furniture, broken windows, and even a small boat overturned by the current. Suddenly, a powerful wave came at them, knocking Mrs. Hudson to the ground. The woman screamed, but Michael reacted instantly, grabbing her arm. He pulled her out of the water, exerting all his strength. The rope wrapped around them seemed to dig into her skin, leaving painful marks, but Michael didn't give up. "We'll make it," he shouted over the sound of the water. "Hold on, we're almost there." A few more steps, and he felt his feet fall into the hole. The stream instantly enveloped him, pouring icy water over his face and hands. He lost his balance and fell. At that moment it seemed to him that it was all over, but the thought that Mrs. Hudson was counting on him gave him strength. Michael grabbed the air with his mouth and pulled himself up, finding the bottom, and straightened up, still holding the woman's hand. They were in an open area where the water was up to their waists, but the current was still strong. Michael could see a salvageable hill ahead of them, concrete steps to an old office building that led up to a rooftop. This roof could be their refuge. "Look, over there," he shouted to the woman, pointing to the steps. She nodded, but it was obvious that her strength was failing her. Michael made a decision. He picked her up in his arms, tensing every muscle, and moved slowly toward the steps. The water pounded against his chest, but he persevered. Each movement was difficult, but he knew he had no right to stop. When they almost reached the steps, another shock of water nearly knocked them both down. Michael felt his legs lose their footing. At the last moment, he threw the rope over the stair railing and grabbed hold of it. Holding on, he pulled the woman closer while trying to get out himself. His hands burned with pain, but he gritted his teeth, realizing that her life depended on him. "I won't leave you, Mrs. Hudson," he shouted, pulling her out of the water. With a final effort, he lifted her up the steps and then pulled himself out. They both collapsed on the cold concrete, panting with exhaustion. The woman was shivering, but her eyes were full of gratitude. "You saved me, boy." "You're a hero," she whispered through her tears, pressing his wet hand to her face. But Michael knew there was more work to be done. He saw people still trying to get out of flooded houses, heard cries for help. The water was still coming in, and every moment was worth its weight in gold. He stood up and looked around, gathering his strength. The rescue helicopters were circling overhead, but they hadn't come down yet. Michael decided not to wait for them. His heart was pounding in his chest like a drum, but he wasn't going to stop. He was ready to throw himself into the water again to save those who needed help. He looked at Mrs. Hudson. "You stay here," he said firmly. "I'll be back." The woman wanted to say something, but only nodded as she watched him jump back into the raging stream. It was the moment when an ordinary boy became a hero from nowhere who was not afraid to defy nature itself. The storm continued to rage, but Michael, tired though he was, returned to the churning waters again and again to help those who remained trapped. He didn't count how many people he had saved. An elderly couple, a teenager trapped in a car, a dog trapped on a floating piece of furniture. To him, they were just people who needed help. He didn't think about himself, only about not leaving anyone behind. What he didn't know was that his exploits were being watched closely. On the opposite side of the street, surviving the watery chaos, a man stood in the shadow of an old building. His face was hidden by a hood, and his figure seemed indistinct due to the dense rain. The stranger was as still as a statue, his gaze fixed on Michael. The man appeared suddenly, almost like the storm itself. He was driving through town in a black SUV when the elements blocked his way. Unlike the others, he didn't give in to panic. Instead, he chose to observe, standing in the pouring rain as if studying the situation. He was in his 50s, but there was an unprecedented confidence in his movements, and his eyes beneath his hood glittered with keen intelligence. First, the stranger noticed the boy pulling an elderly woman out of the house. Then he saw Michael swim across the stream to pull a child with a crying mother. Each time, the boy returned, wet, shivering from the cold, but with unwavering determination. For a moment, it seemed to the man that the boy was more than just a child. It was as if he were the embodiment of resilience against the fury of nature. The man pulled his cell phone out of his pocket, but there were no signals. He looked at Michael again and pulled a small pair of binoculars from under his jacket. Through the magnified lenses, he looked closer at the boy, a lean figure, an emaciated face, but a fire in his eyes. It was not childish courage, but something deeper, stronger. "Who are you, boy?" muttered the stranger under his breath. The man decided to stay in the shadows, not to interfere. There was something about this child that caught his eye, a memory from his own past. The boy's gaze reminded him of the look he'd seen in the mirror when he was younger, the look of someone who was used to fighting the world without expecting anything in return. At some point, Michael felt that he was being watched. He looked up, but saw nothing but the blurred outlines of buildings and the rain dripping off the roofs. He tried to dismiss the feeling, but it wouldn't leave him. Meanwhile, the hooded man continued to watch. When the boy once again returned to safety, laying the rescued woman on the steps, the stranger exhaled quietly. "You can't buy or learn that kind of courage," he said to himself. "You either have it or you don't." Suddenly, from around the corner of the ruined building, another man, dressed in a business suit, which was completely inappropriate in such conditions, approached the man. The man, shivering from the rain, leaned toward the stranger. "We have to leave, sir. The water is rising higher and higher. Your car is barely afloat," he said nervously. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he kept looking at Michael until he disappeared behind another flood of water, going to rescue another victim of the elements. Only then did he turn to his companion. "No, I'll stay," he said firmly. "I want to see what that boy can still do." "But, sir, it's dangerous," the companion objected. "There's no communication here, and if we get stuck—" "I said we're staying," the man interrupted him. The man didn't argue. He retreated into the shadows, but mentally noted that the stranger looked as if he saw something in the boy that no one else did. Michael, meanwhile, had pulled another woman out of the water and was exhausted. But he still refused to rest. The hooded man knew this was no ordinary child. At that moment, he made a decision. "I have to talk to him. This boy, he's not just a hero. He's someone who can change not only his life, but the lives of many. Perhaps that's why I'm here." The stranger took a step out of his shadow, but Michael had already disappeared into the distant stream in pursuit of another life saved. The man only grinned. "We'll meet again, boy," he said, looking out into the raging elements, "and it will be the beginning of something more." In the morning, the city seemed to be quiet, breathing hard after the storm. The sky, freed from the heavy clouds, glowed with soft shades of blue and gold, but the city remained in chaos. Streets that had been bustling with life yesterday were covered with mud, debris, and the remains of things carried away by the flood. Here and there one could see overturned cars, broken houses, and wet scraps of clothing caught in tree branches. Michael woke up early. He spent the night in a small room above Old Man Jenkins' workshop. He managed to get back here late at night when the water level began to drop. The cold and fatigue kept him awake for a long time, but his body, exhausted from fighting the storm, found the strength for a short, heavy sleep. He stood up, glancing at himself in the mirror. His face was pale in the reflection. Dark circles around his eyes and his palms were covered with abrasions and bruises. His clothes, what was left of them, were drying on a chair by the door. Michael put on a shirt and old pants he'd found in the workshop drawer and went outside. The city was unrecognizable. People began to come out of their homes and shelters, but their faces reflected shock and fatigue. No one was smiling. They moved slowly, picking through the rubble, pulling things out of the mud and checking for survivors. Some stood silent, staring at the destruction as if it were a nightmare that had suddenly become reality. Michael walked down the street, trying to help those he saw. He lifted fallen boxes, helped carry boards, and pull furniture out of the mud. But his thoughts were far away. The images of yesterday were still flashing before his eyes. The cold water, the cries for help, the faces of those he had rescued. And the strange feeling that someone was watching him kept him awake. "Michael!" Mrs. Hudson shouted when she saw him. She was standing outside her dilapidated house, leaning on the stairs. There was a grateful smile on her face. "Are you all right, boy?" He nodded, coming closer. She hugged him tightly, her aged hands still trembling but incredibly warm. "You saved me, and not just me. A lot of people say they've seen you help. You're a real hero," she said, wiping away her tears. "I don't even know how to thank you." "It doesn't matter, Mrs. Hudson," Michael said quietly. "It doesn't matter, Mrs. Hudson," Michael said quietly. She wanted to say something else, but their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a motor. Everyone on the street turned around. A shiny black car was driving slowly down the ruined road. Its body reflected the morning sun, and the rumble of the engine was louder than it needed to be in such a quiet place. The car stopped right in front of the workshop where Michael lived. The boy froze, feeling his heart racing. He didn't know why, but the appearance of this car seemed strange, almost frightening. A tall man in a black suit, looking to be in his 50s, stepped out of the car. His face was stern but calm, and his eyes were shrewd like those of a predator. He looked around, as if searching for someone. "It's him," Mrs. Hudson whispered quietly, looking at Michael. "He's come for you." Michael wanted to ask who it was, but the man was already striding toward him. His steps were slow but sure, like a man accustomed to authority. He stopped a few feet away from the boy, his head bowed as if studying him. "Are you the boy?" he finally asked. His voice was low, deep and yet soft. "The one who saved so many people yesterday?" Michael felt the heat flood his cheeks. He wasn't used to someone paying so much attention to him. "I was just helping," he replied quietly. The man grinned. "Modesty is a good thing. But your actions speak louder than words, boy," he said, shoving his hands in his pockets. "You've done something even an adult wouldn't dare to do. It can't be ignored." Michael wanted to ask who he was and why he was suddenly interested in him, but something about the man kept him silent. The stranger pulled a business card out of his pocket and handed it to the boy. "My name is Mr. Carter. I want to talk to you." "But not here," he said, pointing at the car. You deserve a lot more than you think you do." Michael took the card and looked at it. Only his name and phone number were engraved on it. There was no explanation. "Why?" he finally asked. "You'll find out in due time," Carter replied, smiling. His smile was barely perceptible, but there was mystery in it. "Get some rest, boy. You have important choices ahead of you." With these words, he turned around and went back to the car. The car started and soon disappeared around the corner, leaving only a plume of dust behind it. Michael stood in the middle of the ruined street, clutching his business card in his hand. The strange feeling that had plagued him since morning was even stronger now. He didn't know what lay ahead of him, but deep inside he already felt that yesterday's feat was only the beginning of something more. The day began to slowly bring the city back to life. Even though the destruction was everywhere, the residents were busy trying to clear the streets and find what was left of their belongings. Michael didn't sit idle either. He helped carry heavy boards, move fallen logs, and shovel dirt. But the strange feeling that had remained after Mr. Carter's visit did not leave him. It was already evening, as the sun was slowly sinking into the sunset, and the streets were unusually quiet. People were going home to rest after an exhausting day. It was at that moment that Michael heard the familiar low rumble of an engine. He turned around. The black car reappeared on the horizon. Its shiny body stood out against the ruin, like a foreign element in this chaotic landscape. The car moved slowly, almost majestically, as if it were deliberately attracting stares. Everyone in the vicinity stopped. People froze, whispering and pointing at the car. "Who's that?" I heard a voice. "It's the car that was here this morning." Yeah. What's she doing here again?" The car pulled up to the same spot where it had stopped in the morning. The engine died down, but the doors did not open. It remained dark inside. The tinted windows blocked any view. Many people became uneasy. Some residents, reaching closer, stopped, afraid to get too close. Michael stood at the entrance to Jenkins' workshop, watching the scene. His heart clenched. Mr. Carter's business card was still in his pocket. It suddenly seemed heavy, as if the tiny piece of paper were filled with a responsibility he knew nothing about. "Michael," Mrs. Hudson called out to him, peering out from her temporary shelter. Her face was a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Is that for you?" Michael shook his head, but he wasn't sure of the answer himself. The long silence was broken only by the creak of a metal handle. People held their breath for a moment. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out of the car. But it wasn't Mr. Carter. A man in a gray suit, reserved and stern, walked around the car and stopped in front of it, looking around the crowd. His face was unruffled, as if he were accustomed to stares. He walked around the car, opened the back door, but no one got out. Instead, he pulled out a large envelope sealed with black wax and headed straight for Michael. The crowd seemed to back away, clearing his path. People whispered, glanced around, but no one dared interfere. The man stopped in front of Michael. His cold gray eyes looked directly at the boy. "Michael," he said quietly, "it's for you." The boy stared at the envelope in surprise. His fingers trembled as he took it. The envelope was heavier than he'd expected, and the seal looked strange. It was engraved in black wax with a symbol he didn't recognize. The letters K and S intertwined. "What is it?" he asked. "The answers to your questions," the man said, but there was more to his voice. "Open it when you're ready." Michael wanted to ask more questions, but the man turned abruptly and headed back to the car. The crowd parted again, A few moments later, the door slammed shut, and the black car drove slowly forward, disappearing over the horizon, just as it had done that morning. The crowd around them was talking animatedly. People were trying to guess what had happened. Some said it was a rich benefactor, others that it had to do with Michael's exploits, but the boy didn't listen to them. He stared at the envelope, feeling his fingers trembling. He knew that this envelope would change everything, and that frightening feeling was growing stronger and stronger. The next day, the black car reappeared outside Jenkins' workshop. This time it arrived quietly, as if it knew in advance that it would be seen. Its shiny body gleamed in the morning sun, attracting the eyes of the people who were still dealing with the aftermath of the flood. The locals started whispering again, casting quick glances at Michael. "It's for you again, Michael," Mrs. Hudson said, leaning out of the window of her temporary shelter. Her voice sounded concerned, but with a touch of curiosity. The boy clenched his fists, watching the car door slowly open. This time, a woman stepped out of the car. She looked different from the man in the gray suit who had arrived earlier. Tall, with impeccably styled hair and wearing an elegant navy blue pantsuit, she stood out among the dusty streets, ruined houses, and plain clothes of the townspeople. Her shoes, clearly not designed for such conditions, were buried in mud, but she didn't pay the slightest attention to it. The woman stopped in front of the crowd, glancing around at everyone present, and as soon as her eyes met Michael's, she headed straight for him. Her movements were precise, confident, like someone accustomed to command. "Are you Michael?" she asked, standing in front of him. Her voice was firm, with a touch of sternness, but not harsh. Michael nodded. It was hard for him to make out what he was feeling, a mixture of fear, bewilderment, and inexplicable curiosity. "My name is Victoria Carter," she continued. "I represent an organization that has taken an interest in you. We observed your actions during yesterday's disaster." The crowd around them whispered even louder. People were looking at each other, trying to figure out who Victoria was and what organization was mentioned in her words. Michael felt dozens of eyes on him. It was pressuring, but he held on. "What's the organization?" he asked, looking her straight in the eye. She smiled faintly, as if she had expected that question. "That's not important, at least not right now," she said. "What matters is that we value people like you, people who are able to act even when others are afraid. We look for talent, and you, Michael, are exactly what we're looking for." The boy frowned. He didn't understand what she was talking about. His exploit was just an attempt to help people. He never thought it would interest anyone. "What do you want me for?" he finally asked. His voice sounded firm, though the tension was still building inside. "You've saved a lot of lives," Victoria said. "Not because you were ordered to, but because you wanted to. It's a quality that can't be taught, Michael. It's in you. People like you are rare." She paused, scrutinizing the boy's reaction. Then she pulled a small leather case from the inside pocket of her jacket and handed it to him. "It's for you, but don't open it now. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." Michael took the case, his fingers trembling. It was made of soft leather, and the lid was engraved with the same symbol as the envelope from yesterday, the intertwined letters K and S. "Why don't you speak plainly?" he asked. "What kind of organization is this? Why are you following me?" Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly, but her face remained calm. "Because some answers are best learned in due time," she said. "We're not rushing fate, Michael. We're just helping it go in the right direction." She took a step back, and nodded toward the car. The driver, who had been standing by the open door the whole time, came over to escort her back to the car. But before she got in, she looked back at Michael. "You're special, Michael. You can change not only your life, but the lives of many others. Just be ready. And remember, you always have a choice." With these words, she disappeared into the car. The car started up again and, just like last time, slowly disappeared over the horizon, leaving Michael alone with the case in his hands. The crowd began to disperse, leaving the boy alone. It seemed to him that the world around him was silent. He stared at the case, feeling something new stirring inside him, a mixture of anxiety and strange anticipation. What do these people really want from him? And what kind of future awaits him? Michael did not yet know that this moment would be the beginning of a journey that would change everything. After his meeting with Victoria, Michael couldn't find a place to be. It seemed to him that every look, every phrase of the neighbors hid something. The whole town was discussing the black car, the mysterious strangers, and Michael's exploits. But his thoughts revolved around one detail he couldn't get out of his head: the Mrs. Hudson he had saved. From the beginning, her behavior seemed unusual. She was grateful for the rescue, but there was something more behind her smiles and warm words. She often spoke cryptic phrases, looking at Michael as if she knew more about him than he did. Mrs. Hudson had a reputation as a quiet and kind woman, but no one in town knew her background. She had moved here about 10 years ago, buying an old house on the outskirts. She had no children, and there were only rumors about her husband. Some said he had died under tragic circumstances, others that she had never married. Michael remembered how the woman had reacted strangely when he had rescued her from the raging elements. She had hugged him, but her hands were trembling with more than fear. She seemed to know that the storm would bring more than just destruction. Now that Victoria and her mysterious organization were on the horizon, Michael felt that Mrs. Hudson knew something important, and that something concerned not only herself, but him as well. The next day, Michael decided to talk to Mrs. Hudson. He found her sitting on the porch of the surviving house. She was holding an old, shabby photograph. Her eyes were staring off into the distance, but when she heard footsteps, she looked up. "Michael," she said with a smile, but there was weariness in her voice. "I knew you'd come." "Mrs. Hudson," the boy began, sitting down beside me, "I need to know. Who are you? Why do I feel like all of this, you, Victoria, this car is connected?" The woman was silent for a long time, looking at the photograph in her hands. Finally, she sighed and spoke slowly. "There's something you need to know, Michael. I was never just a kind old lady living in the shadows. My past is more complicated than you can imagine." The boy looked at her without interrupting. "Once upon a time," she continued, "I was part of an organization similar to the one that is now interested in you. But it was different, violent, dangerous. We called it the Syndicate." Michael frowned. The name didn't tell him anything, but he felt that the story was just beginning. "They were looking for people like you, someone who stood out for their bravery, their ability to act in critical situations. They trained them, used, often for personal gain." "Used for what?" Michael asked quietly. "For whatever they saw fit, from military operations to manipulation, political or economic. I was part of their team. For a long time I believed it was a good cause, that we were saving the world. But then I learned the truth." She fell silent, clutching the photograph in her hands. "What truth?" Michael insisted. "What they are doing is not salvation. It's control. They believe they have the right to control the lives of others, to make decisions for everyone. I couldn't accept that. So I left. Mrs. Hudson raised her eyes to him. I escaped. It wasn't easy. They were looking for me, trying to get me to come back. But I managed to escape. For years I lived quietly, hoping that my existence would be forgotten. Do you think they, found you? Michael asked quietly. She nodded. When I saw the black car and then found out they were interested in you, I knew it wasn't an accident. Michael felt a chill inside. What's that picture? He asked, pointing to the picture in her hands. Mrs. Hudson slowly held it out to him. The photo showed a group of people standing in front of a massive building. They all looked like employees of some elite organization. Among them was a young woman whom Michael immediately recognized as Mrs. Hudson. But it was something else that caught his attention. "That's him," he whispered, pointing to the man in the center of the picture. It was Mr. Carter. "Yes," Mrs. Hudson confirmed. "He was one of the leaders of the syndicate. He hasn't changed. If he's interested in you, Michael, he must have a plan." "Why would he want me?" Michael asked. "Because you're special," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I've seen people like you. They have a gift. Not strength, not intelligence, but intuition. An inner courage that makes them unique. But be careful. Carter and his kind see people like you not as people, but as tools." Michael was silent for a long time, holding the photograph. It seemed to him that his whole world had turned upside down. His feat, which he thought was accidental, had turned out to be part of something bigger. He realized that now he was no longer just a boy who had saved lives. He was part of a game whose rules he had yet to learn. "What am I supposed to do?" he finally asked. "Be prepared," Mrs. Hudson replied, "and remember that you will have to make a choice." Michael felt there was no going back from this point. He had to not only learn the truth, but also decide what role he was willing to play in this mysterious and dangerous story. The next day, the black car reappeared outside Jenkins' workshop, as if expecting Michael to come out himself. And the boy came out. He felt that it was pointless to postpone talking. Questions raged inside him, and Mrs. Hudson's strange stories only added to the tension. The car stood still, gleaming in the morning sun. Michael approached slowly, feeling his heart beating fast in his chest. The door opened, and Mr. Carter stepped out of the car. His gaze was calm, but there was a steely determination in it. "Good morning, Michael," he said. "I'm glad you decided to talk." Michael didn't say anything back, but his gaze was hard. He wasn't going to give this man any reason to think he was weak or afraid. "Shall we walk?" Carter suggested, pointing to the ruined street. It was an odd suggestion, but Michael nodded. They walked along the houses, past people busy rebuilding their lives. Carter, despite his expensive clothes, moved easily, as if he were part of the scene. "You've probably realized by now that you're not just an ordinary boy," Carter began, looking at Michael. "What you did in the flood took courage that not everyone has. You acted quickly, without thinking about yourself, and that's what makes you special." "I don't think I'm special," Michael replied quietly. "I was just helping people." Carter smiled slightly, but that smile was more thoughtful than genuine. "That's what makes you unique, Michael. Most people think of themselves first. You don't. It's people like you who change the world." Michael stopped and looked at him. "Why are you here? Why me?" Carter stopped, turning toward him. "Because I see potential in you. You can accomplish so much more than just being a local hero. You can become someone who will change the lives of thousands, if not millions of people. How? Through training, resources, the right opportunities. Carter spoke with the tone of a man accustomed to persuasion. I have an organization, Michael. We work with people like you and help them discover their potential. I suggest you join. Michael frowned. Join what? Carter took a step closer. To something bigger than you can imagine. We educate, we guide. We give those who deserve it the opportunity to impact the world. Think about it, Michael. You've lived alone, struggled to survive. You deserve better than that. What am I going to have to do? Michael asked bluntly. Carter held his gaze on the boy, as if weighing how much he should say. To help us, he finally answered. To help make the world a better place. To influence situations that could change the fate of many. That's it? Michael couldn't believe the simplicity of those words. Carter grinned. No, Michael, it's more complicated than that. You're going to make hard choices. Sometimes against your will, sometimes against your principles. But that's the price you pay for being able to influence the future. Those words hurt Michael. He thought of Mrs. Hudson's stories about the syndicate and their methods. And if I say no? He asked bluntly. Carter tilted his head slightly. Then you'll go back to your normal life, maybe even live it quietly, but you'll know you missed your chance to make a difference. Michael was silent for a long time, digesting what he had heard. He realized that Carter was a clever man, used to manipulation, but his words sounded sincere. It's a choice, Michael, Carter continued. We're not forcing you. You can say no, and I'll leave without asking any more questions. Or you can say yes and discover a new world. Michael looked at Carter, then at the people around him. He saw the residents still rebuilding their homes, Mrs. Hudson helping her neighbors. These people were real heroes, not demanding awards or recognition. I have conditions, he said at last. Carter raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. If I accept, it's only to help people. Not for power, not for money, but for real help. And if I see your organization doing something wrong, I will leave. Carter looked at him carefully. His gaze grew even more serious. Strong words for such a young age, he said, but I accept your terms. He held out his hand, and Michael, hesitating, shook it. Welcome to the new world, Michael, Carter said. Opportunities will open up for you that you never dreamed possible. But remember, with them comes responsibility. Carter returned to the car, leaving Michael standing in the street, immersed in his thoughts. The black car drove away, slow and silent as always, leaving the boy at the threshold of a new, unknown chapter of his life. He knew he had taken a step into the unknown, but his decision was firm. He felt like he was just beginning to learn what he was really capable of. Michael stood in the middle of the street for a long time, staring at the black car until it disappeared over the horizon. The world around him seemed strangely quiet, despite the continuing bustle of residents clearing away the debris. His hand still felt Carter's firm shake, and his words echoed in his head. Welcome to a new world. With opportunity comes responsibility. The boy walked back to Jenkins' workshop, feeling that he was being watched, perhaps by Carter himself, perhaps by his own conscience. He closed the door behind him and sat down in an old chair by the window. On the table lay the case Victoria had given him. Michael stared at it for a long moment, as if afraid to touch it. You have to open it, came a voice from the door. Michael turned around. It was Mrs. Hudson. Her face was serious, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I know what they offered you, Michael," she continued, moving closer. "They always offer the same thing, the opportunity to be something more, but you have to understand what's behind it." The boy sighed. "They say I can change the world," he said, turning to the woman. "But at what cost?" She sat down across from me, her gaze heavy. "Carter doesn't lie," she admitted. "You really can do a lot of things, but you have to be prepared that this road won't be easy. They'll stop at nothing if they think the end justifies the means, even if it goes against your principles." Michael looked at the case. He knew that inside it was hidden the key to a new life, but with it a new world of responsibility, difficult decisions, and danger. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. "It's up to you," Mrs. Hudson said, putting her hand on his shoulder. "But remember, Michael, if you choose this path, you can't go back." Michael opened the case. Inside was a small metal disc with that very symbol, the intertwined letters K and C. The word initiative was engraved on the disc. Next to it was a note with the coordinates and time of the meeting. "It will only start if you choose," it said on it. The boy clutched the disc in his hand. Carter had given him the choice to go forward or stay. But the choice was harder than it might seem. If he refused, he could go on with his normal life, helping people in his city. But he would always know he could have done more. If he said yes, he would enter a world where things would become more complicated, where his decisions could affect the lives of many, but not always for the better. Michael spent the rest of the night thinking. He remembered the faces of those he had saved, the cries for help, the moments when he had risked his own life for others. He realized that he had what many did not: courage, intuition, determination. But he also realized that he would have to sacrifice his ordinary life for this journey. At dawn, he went outside, disc in hand. Mrs. Hudson was waiting for him on the porch, her face calm but her eyes alert. "Have you made up your mind?" she asked quietly. Michael nodded, his face expressing hardness. "Yes," he said, "but I'll follow my own rules. If they want to change me or use me for something bad, I'll leave." Mrs. Hudson smiled, but her smile was sad. "I hope you find the strength to keep that promise," she said. Michael said goodbye to Mrs. Hudson and to Jenkins' workshop. He walked through the streets of the city, watching the people he was helping. Some waved at him, some smiled. They saw him as a hero, though he still felt like an ordinary boy. When he reached the designated spot, a black car was waiting for him. Carter got out of the car, his face still calm. "You've made your decision," he said, looking intently at Michael. "Yes," the boy replied, "but I do it by my own rules." Carter nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer. "Let's get started, then," he said as he opened the car door. Michael got in, and the car moved smoothly. He looked back at the city behind him, but he knew his life would never be the same again. The car disappeared into the distance, leaving behind only dust on the road. The town returned to its normal life, but people still remembered the boy who had saved them on the day of the flood. No one knew where he had gone or what he was doing now. Some said he had become a great man who helped others. Others believed he was in a dangerous game from which there was no escape. Whatever lay ahead for Michael, he knew one thing. His choice would change not only his fate, but the fates of many others. And that was just the beginning. If you've read this story to the end, be sure to write about it in the comments. We'd love to know what you think about Michael's fate, his choices, and the mysterious organization he joined. Your thoughts, ideas, and impressions are incredibly important to us because it's because of you that we're able to create stories like this. If you enjoyed it and want to know what happens next, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new chapters and other exciting stories. Your support inspires us to work even harder. And of course, share this story with your friends. Maybe they'll have their own opinions on how Michael should have acted. We look forward to your comments and hope to see you again.